Well, hello everybody again. This is Robin Robinson and welcome back to the complete whiskey course video edition. So in the last couple videos we did here, we talked about two types of distillation, right? So we talked about column still distillation, or represented by this old Octomore can right here. And we talked about pot still distillation, represented by obviously a pot, right? So now we're going to talk about whiskey specifically, what comes out of there, what's the whole point of this, and particularly we're going to talk about Scotch whiskey, and I'm going to just lay this out right now. This is kind of where I cut my teeth. This is what brought me over to being a whiskey drinker. It goes back 30 or so years ago, and when I lied for an event and told everybody I was a Scotch whiskey distiller. And no one had any idea what that meant at that time, and no one had ever heard anybody speak with a Scottish accent. So I was able to really get over on everyone for an entire evening. And it turns out at the end of the night, I fell in love with Scotch whiskey. At that time, I had no idea what the word single malt Scotch whiskey even meant. But the next day, when they paid me in cash, I went out and bought my first bottle, and it's been a love affair ever since. So, first we're going to talk about like the taxonomy of whiskey. And taxonomy is just nothing but sort of a nice visual map, a guide map, a road map to kind of give us an idea about what we're talking about, right? So all of whiskey is over here, right? So that's the top one over here. And all whiskey, as we know, is made out of grains that are fermented into a beer and then cooked in one of these two different types of vessels. And as you can see right here, that's pretty simple. This is all whiskey. And then the first layer right here is all of the countries that make whiskey. And you can see the ones on the top represent Scotland, Ireland, United States, Canada, and Japan. They make more whiskey than anyone else. So those are the top 5 whiskey making countries. And then over here we have all of the other whiskey countries that are starting to make whiskey, everyone from Australia to France to India to Taiwan and so on. It's when we get into this next chapter right here, and this is why whiskey starts arguments, because no one can really agree on what the hell whiskey is, because it's got so many definitions. So we're going to talk specifically about Scotch. So here's another map, so get ready for this. This is the taxonomy of Scotch whiskey. And as you can see, I've broken it down into a mnemonic of 3 different numbers: 2, 5, and 3. So if we just kind of keep that in our minds, 2, 5, and 3, then we'll kind of get a picture of what it is we're trying to talk about. Now, if you go to Scotland and you go to visit a distillery, you will go to only one of 2 types of distillery. One is a malt distillery, right, where they make single malt primarily out of 100% malted barley, okay? And I'll show you some examples of that. The second type of distillery that you would go to is called a grain distillery. And in a grain distillery, they're using these types of stills, these big column stills, and they call them grain distilleries because they're using multiple grains besides barley, right? So they're typically using a lot of wheat mixed in with some corn and some barley. So it's kind of like very similar to what a mash bill in bourbon is, right? But it's really all about making a very high-proofed grain whiskey. So those are the 2 types. We've got malt whiskey here, and we've got grain whiskey here. Now, there are 5 categories based on the 2 types. So malt whiskey and grain whiskey, there are 5 categories. The first category is what we would call a single malt, and that is a malt whiskey made from a single distillery. So here's probably one of the most famous names that you'll understand from that, Macallan, right? So what this tells you on the label is that everything in this bottle was distilled at the Macallan Distillery, right? And it says here, Highland Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. So Highland's not really necessary, that's more of a marketing term, but single malt Scotch whiskey are 4 specific legal definitions to be used to describe Scotch whiskey. So there's a great example of a single malt. Here's another great example of a single malt here. Here's something you're probably not too familiar with. It's called Glen Garioch. Now, it looks like Glen Garioch, but it's not. It's Glen Garioch. There's no one way to really understand how to do a Scottish pronunciation unless you go up on the internet and listen to a famous actor, Brian Cox, pronounce all of the distillery names. So go ahead and do that. You can Google that. So that's actually a lot of fun. A single malt Scotch whiskey. So it says that right there under the name, the single malt Scotch whiskey. So that is a Scotch whiskey that is made from 100% barley in a single distillery. Okay. Now, the second type of whiskey is a single grain Scotch whiskey. And that's actually, interestingly enough, the volume of single grain whiskey outdoes the volume of single malt whiskey by about 9-1. But you're not really familiar with any of them because typically they don't make them to put into bottles. I'll tell you in a second about typically where they're used. But it's typically not used, sold as a consumer type of an item. Now, here's a couple examples of some that are. Here's our good friends at the Loch Lomond distillery, right? And you can see on the label it says single grain Scotch whiskey. So it's a bunch of different grains from a single distillery. In this case, it's Loch Lomond, right? And it meets the qualifications for Scotch whiskey. So this is kind of a rare bird out there. And here's another rare bird right here. This is from the Invergordon distillery, right? As you can see right here. And it is, again, single grain Scotch whiskey. So it's a bunch of different grains, mostly wheat. Up here, actually, they use mostly corn at Invergordon. And it's distilled very high in the column, so it's a little bit brighter, a little less characteristic. Okay, now, what does all that mean? So when you take single malt whiskey and you blend it with single grain whiskey, what you get is that guy right in the middle, which is blended Scotch whiskey. Now, blended Scotch whiskey by itself means that I've taken one or more grain whiskeys from different single distilleries, one or more malt whiskeys from single distilleries, and I blended those together. And guess what? That's typically what the world knows as Scotch whiskey. And if you're looking for a couple examples, how about that? Cutty Sark, right? Johnny Walker. Pig's Nose, right? Here's a blended Scotch whiskey right there. Black Bottle, right there. Blended Scotch whiskey right there. Johnny Walker, gold label, black label, and red label, blended Scotch whiskeys, right? So, those are all examples, and that pretty much outstrips single malt whiskey in production by a factor of about 9-1. So maybe about 90% of all the whiskeys that are shipped out of Scotland are shipped out as blended Scotch whiskey. The world knows Scotch as a blend. And interestingly enough, France is the largest importer of blended Scotch whiskey. They've got more of a thirst for it than actually the United States. So we've got single malt whiskey, we've got single grain whiskey, we've got blended Scotch whiskey, right? Now, check out the other two, right? I put single malt, single grain together, I make a blended Scotch. But when I put more than one single malt whiskey together, I make a blended malt. Now, in the old days, before the rules were rewritten in 2009, that was typically called a vatted malt, or it could have been called a double malt, or even a triple malt. But after 2009, the Scotch Whisky Association kind of tightened up all of the regulations, and they called it a blended malt. Well, here's a real famous one right here from Compass Box. This is called Spice Tree, and it is called a blended malt Scotch whiskey. Another famous blended malt, for example, would be Johnny Walker Green Label, right? The green label is a blended malt, but the red, the blue, the gold, and the black are blended Scotch. And now you see why this is complicated, okay? Now, the next the next category, right, is something that's actually very rare. And let me see if I've got a bottle of it here somewhere. Just hold on for a second. I'll be right back. I got to find this bottle. I forgot to pull it ahead of time. Okay. Blended grain Scotch whiskey, and there aren't very many of them out there. So let's go back again to our good friends at Compass Box, and this is an older version, but this is called Hedonism, and it is a rare example of a blended grain Scotch whiskey. Now this is interesting. This label is so old that this was before the regulations were rewritten, and at that time Compass Box was putting on grain Scotch whiskey. It now actually is officially called blended Scotch whiskey. So those are the 5 categories, right? 2 types, 5 categories, and 3 of them have the word blend in it. But as you can see, a blended Scotch, a blended malt Scotch, and a blended grain Scotch whiskey are essentially 3 different fruits that are being given the name of the basket that holds them, right? So they're clear, one's a strawberry, one's a pineapple, and one's a banana, right? But they're 3 completely different styles of whiskey. So that's Scotch whiskey. That's pretty much it. It's complicated, but you have to just kind of get in there and remember, the more you practice, the better you get on it. So I'll talk to you soon. We'll take on another type of whiskey after this.